Nice, France, May 6, 2014. At around 7:30 in the evening, Hela Pastor, a businesswoman from Monaco, left the Larche hospital. That Tuesday, as she did every day, Hela had come to visit her son, Gildo, who had been hospitalized several months earlier after suffering a stroke. As she exited the hospital building, Hela walked toward the parking lot to her car, a black Lancia Voyager with tinted windows, driven by her chauffeur, Mohammed Darwish. She got into the car and Mohammed carefully began to pull out of the hospital parking lot onto the main road. At that very moment, a man suddenly ran up to the vehicle. In his hands, he was holding a shotgun. The first shot rang out, shattering the passenger side window. But the man kept firing, again and again. After emptying his weapon at point-blank range into the car, he crossed the street, threw the gun into a bag, and quickly fled the scene. This audacious attack took place in broad daylight, in front of numerous witnesses. And one of the victims was none other than 77-year-old Hela Pastor, often called the Vice Princess of Monaco. The nickname reflected her influence and her close ties to Monaco's ruling Grimaldi family. Hela was the wealthiest woman in Monaco, far richer than the princely family itself. Her fortune, estimated at 12 billion euros, was inherited from her father. Gildo Pastor had built a vast real estate empire, methodically covering the principality with concrete during the 1960s and 1970s. At the time, he had a simple yet brilliant idea. Instead of selling the apartment buildings he constructed, as other developers did, he kept ownership and rented out both residential and commercial spaces. This empire was passed down to Hela, who managed it and collected rent from some of the most expensive properties in the world. To rent a two-room apartment in Monaco, one needs at least 4,000 euros per month. Needless to say, the Pastor family had plenty of rivals in this lucrative business. It's no surprise that in this tiny kingdom of concrete and wealth, rumors quickly began to spread. After all, Monaco is an extremely small state, just 2 square kilometers in size, home to only about 38,000 people. The principality was soon abuzz with speculation, but to their credit, the Nice police officers kept their composure and set about conducting a proper investigation. They quickly established that, as she had done every day for several weeks, Hela had visited her son, Gildo, at the hospital on that Tuesday. He had been hospitalized following a stroke. The attacker ambushed her car just as it was pulling out from the hospital grounds onto the road. Hela was struck in the jaw, neck, and chest. The second victim was her 64-year-old driver, Mohammed Darwish. He was shot twice, in the abdomen and chest. Both victims suffered grave injuries, but were still alive, and medical staff rushed to assist them. They were at least fortunate that the attack occurred right next to a hospital. As doctors fought to save their lives, police officers began carefully examining the crime scene. They needed to determine whether this had been a random robbery or whether the attacker had specifically been waiting for this particular car, and who, in fact, had been the main target, Hela Pastor or her modest chauffeur, Mohammed Darwish. Mohammed had come to Monaco from Egypt. For the past 20 years, he had not only served as Helene's driver, but also as her butler, advisor, and trusted confidant. She could hardly manage without him. Mohammed was a straightforward, hardworking, and honest man who never involved himself in any trouble, and the police quickly established that he had not been the intended target. That meant the assailant had been lying in wait for Hela. Given that she visited her son in the hospital every day, setting up an ambush was not difficult. Moreover, her handbag was found inside the car, containing 1,800 euros in cash and her bank cards. This allowed investigators to dismiss the theory of a random robbery. On the other hand, if the attack had been premeditated, the choice of weapon was rather unusual. The killer had used a hunting shotgun loaded with very small caliber cartridges, the kind hunters use for small birds like quail or partridge. These were not the type of rounds typically used by professional hitmen. As a precaution, the police searched Helene's apartment and confirmed that nothing had been taken. The jewelry and gold bars in her safe were untouched. Investigators spoke with all members of Helene's family, her husband, Professor Claude Palanca, her son Gildo, a well-known race car driver and businessman, her daughter, businesswoman Sylvia, and Sylvia's boyfriend, businessman Wojciech Janowski. All of them insisted that there had been no problems within the family. Yes, they were very wealthy, but otherwise they were, as they put it, a perfectly normal family. Hela had no enemies. She was known to be a generous woman who never acted maliciously toward her business rivals and led a quiet, respectable life. Wojciech, in particular, told police that Hela had been very fond of him and that he could not have wished for a better mother-in-law. She had welcomed him warmly into the family, he said, and he was shocked and deeply confused by what had happened. Sadly, 4 days later, Helene's driver, Mohammed, succumbed to his injuries. 6 days after that, Helene emerged from her coma. She was still extremely weak, and the doctor's prognosis was far from hopeful, yet they allowed investigators to speak with her. When the lead detective entered her hospital room, she was struck by the strength and dignity of this frail woman. Helene's steely gaze seemed to pierce right through her, as if silently demanding to know why the case had not yet been solved. The victim explained that she had seen an unfamiliar man holding a gun. He simply raised it and fired. She had no idea why anyone would want to shoot her and could offer no clues. She said she had never been threatened and had not felt herself to be in any danger. Unfortunately, that was all she managed to say before she suffered respiratory distress, forcing the detective to end the interview. Before the detective left, however, Helene took her hand and asked her to return as soon as possible. She said there was something important she needed to tell her. The detective nodded, of course, but Hela Pastor would never speak again. She died the following day. Suspicion immediately fell on the Italian mafia. The police did not rule out the possibility that the attack had been carried out by the 'Ndrangheta from Calabria or the Neapolitan Camorra. Real estate along the French Riviera, where Monaco is located, has long been within the sphere of interest of both criminal organizations. Yet something about that theory didn't fit. The attacker's behavior was utterly careless. He hadn't even tried to conceal his face. Despite the presence of nearby security cameras, the killer hadn't bothered to wear a mask or pull up a hood. Moreover, he had fled after wounding his victims without making sure they were dead. Professionals don't act that way. Everything about this case left investigators baffled, from the presence of 2 victims to the choice of ammunition and weapon, and finally the killer's obvious lack of professionalism and caution. The entire crime had been caught on surveillance cameras from beginning to end. The first surprise awaiting the police as they reviewed the footage was that the shooter had an accomplice. Another man had been standing not far from the scene of the attack. He was clearly acting as a lookout, the spotter who gave the signal when Helene's car began slowly pulling out of the hospital parking lot. The spotter was wearing a red cap and holding a white bag with black stripes. This, as it turned out, was extremely helpful for the investigation, since the bright bag made it easy for the police to follow the man's movements through the crowd on the video recordings. And then came the second surprise. The lookout had arrived by taxi. So had his accomplice, the shooter, exactly 10 minutes later. The police were stunned. Normally, criminals use stolen scooters or getaway cars, which they burn immediately after the attack, but not in this case. It was now clear to investigators that both the lookout and the shooter were amateurs. The officers easily located the taxi drivers who had picked up the suspects, and to their astonishment, discovered that the men had ordered the taxis by phone. The police had never seen anything like it. Of course, the accomplices had been smart enough to use new, anonymous SIM cards not registered to their names. But even so, the police managed to trace them. The cards had been purchased about 200 kilometers from Nice, in Marseille, at a shop on La Canbière Street around noon on the very day of the attack. From there, officers began meticulous but highly effective detective work. They reviewed hours of surveillance footage and, thanks to security cameras, were able to trace the entire route taken by the 2 accomplices. At 11:55 a.m., the lookout appeared on Marseille's main and historic street, La Canbière. The man was wearing a blue jacket and carrying that same distinctive bag in his hand. A few minutes later, around noon, he was joined by the shooter. Together, they entered a store where they bought their phones and SIM cards. By 12:19, the 2 men exited the shop and went their separate ways. However, camera by camera, the police continued to track their movements. At 12:46, the shooter arrived at the Marseille-Saint-Charles train station platform, followed shortly afterward by the lookout, still clutching his recognizable bag. The 2 men boarded a TGV high-speed train, and about 2 hours later, at 3:39 p.m., they were seen emerging from the arrival tunnel at Nice station. By that point, the lookout had changed into black clothing, and now the bag was being carried by the shooter. The police got lucky. The Nice station has a surveillance camera positioned to capture the faces of arriving passengers, and it provided clear images of both suspects. All that remained was to match those faces with names. Meanwhile, the suspects checked into a hotel just steps away from the train station. They booked 2 rooms, but never actually stayed in them. Instead, they ordered taxis and left the hotel in separate cars. The lookout departed at 6:18 p.m., and the shooter followed at 6:24 p.m., both headed toward the hospital where Gildo, Hela Pastor's son, was recovering, to ambush and open fire on Helene's car. The hotel maid who cleaned the rooms the two men had rented had already tidied everything up, but when she found a bottle of shower gel in the bathroom, she didn't throw it away. Instead, she placed it on her cleaning cart, just in case the guests returned. That small detail turned out to be crucial. The bottle was sent to the forensic lab where specialists found DNA belonging to one of the men. As it turned out, he was no innocent bystander. 24-year-old Saman Said Ahmed had already served time in prison for drug trafficking. As for the lookout, he too had made a mistake, and an even bigger one. No, he hadn't left behind a bottle with his DNA. Something better. Both criminals had thrown away their SIM cards, but the lookout had continued using the new phone after the attack. That was a gift for the investigators. Through the phone, they identified him as Alher Hamadi, 31 years old, who also had a criminal record for armed robbery. Both men were from the Comoros Islands and lived in Marseille. The detectives still didn't know why two petty thugs from Marseille had come all the way to Nice to kill the wealthiest woman in the Principality of Monaco. But since nothing had been stolen from Helene's handbag, they strongly suspected there was a puppet master behind the crime, perhaps even more than one. In less than 10 days, the police had identified both the shooter and the lookout. But what should they do next? Arrest them immediately and hope they would confess and name whoever had ordered the hit? Or keep them under surveillance and wait for them to lead investigators to whoever was pulling the strings? The investigating magistrate wisely chose the second option. That decision soon proved to be the right one, because the lookout, Alher Hamadi, turned out to be an incredibly talkative man. He spent a lot of time on the phone with someone named Salim Youssef, who, interestingly, was a volunteer assistant to the gendarmerie. Not a full-time officer, but someone who occasionally helped the police informally. Alher and Salim's phone conversations often touched on large sums of money, and they also spoke in veiled terms about a weapon. Both men, Alher and Salim, were also in regular contact with a third person, Abdelkader Belkatir, an electrician working on construction sites in Marseille. And Abdelkader, as it turned out, was the brother-in-law of Pascal Doriac. That was the moment the investigators realized they had finally stumbled onto something truly significant. Pascal was a sports trainer and masseur, providing services to wealthy clients, many of whom lived in Monaco. In particular, he worked as the trainer and masseur for Sylvia, Hela Pastor's daughter, and her boyfriend Wojciech Janowski. He also provided massage services to Hela Pastor herself. At last, the police had established a tangible link between the Marseille thugs and Monaco's elite. On April 29, 2014, exactly 1 week before the attack, Pascal met with the Marseille men in Nice. The police confirmed this because Pascal's phone that day was active in central Nice, at the same place and time as the phones of the lookout Alher Hamadi and the so-called gendarme Salim Youssef. Investigators concluded that this was almost certainly a meeting of the accomplices to discuss the details of the planned attack on Helene and her driver. The police were by now almost certain that Pascal had a direct connection to the murders, since he had been in direct contact with the lookout. But could he really have been the one who ordered the hit? Even though the shooters were amateurs, carrying out such an attack would have required a substantial sum of money. Pascal was a skilled trainer, but he could not have financed a contract of that magnitude. Besides, why would he even want to? Everything finally fell into place when the detectives cross-referenced phone records of Pascal and Wojciech Janowski, Sylvia's boyfriend. It's worth noting that the men rarely called each other, since they saw each other almost every day. Yet one interesting pattern stood out. The number of calls spiked on key dates: the day of the attack, the day Mohammed died, and the day Helene died. A detailed examination of Wojciech's bank statements revealed unusually large cash withdrawals for a man who had never handled such sums before. Between January and April 2014, he had withdrawn nearly 250,000 euros. Previously, any withdrawals had been modest. What else could the police think? They concluded that these 250,000 euros were likely payment for the execution of the murder contract. But Wojciech was a successful businessman, a well-known philanthropist, and someone who genuinely adored his girlfriend's mother. Or did he? Perhaps nothing was as it seemed. Could it be that Sylvia had conflicts with her mother, and she was the one truly behind it all? The police needed answers. Since the detectives had now traced almost every link in the criminal chain, it was time for interrogations. They arrested 20 people, including Helene's daughter, Sylvia. The shooter was uncooperative, but the lookout, Alher Hamadi, proved more talkative. He revealed that he had been hired to organize the murder. Originally, the shooter was supposed to be Salim Youssef, but a few hours before the planned attack, Salim changed his mind and had to be replaced. And quickly, before May 6th, because doctors were planning to discharge Gildo from the hospital. So on the night before the attack, Alher hired the shooter, Samin Sayed Ahmed. Alher immediately sensed that Samin had all the qualities needed for the job, and Samin agreed to be the shooter without asking for details about the target. Alher added that he had handed the shooter 70,000 euros, including a 20,000 euros bonus for killing the driver. This revelation shocked the police. Mohammed had not been a random victim. His name had been explicitly included in the contract, just like Helene's. The client had planned this to confuse the investigation. According to Alher, the masterminds behind the double murder were Pascal, the sports trainer, and his wealthy client, Wojciech Janowski. The police turned their attention to Pascal. The interrogating detective quickly realized that the man was not built for detention, and he was proven right. By the second questioning, Pascal had confessed to everything. It all began a year and a half before the murder in the apartment of Sylvia and Wojciech in Monaco. In the middle of a training session, Wojciech suddenly spoke about Hela Pastor, calling her a heartless, ruthless woman who treated her own daughter like a tyrant. He even suggested that it was because of her mother that Sylvia had developed cancer. Unable to tolerate the oppressive atmosphere Hela created, and unwilling to see his beloved unhappy, Wojciech decided that Hela needed to be removed from this world. He asked Pascal if he could obtain a weapon for him. Pascal was shocked, hoping it was a rhetorical question that Wojciech would never revisit. After all, Wojciech was one of his most influential clients, and it was hard for him to say no. But Pascal's hope was in vain. Wojciech didn't drop the subject. A few weeks later, he asked another question. Did Pascal know anyone willing to carry out the job? At the same time, Wojciech became unusually friendly with Pascal, leaving him plane tickets to London and Thailand, giving him gifts, including a luxurious wristwatch. Soon enough, Pascal gave in. Perhaps he feared losing his clients and livelihood. Perhaps he was tempted by the newfound luxuries. Or perhaps both. In any case, when Wojciech handed him the first envelope containing 20,000 euros, he could not refuse. Pascal then found the hitman. According to him, the total price of the contract was 140,000 euros for the actual killing of Hela and her driver, with each perpetrator receiving their share. Interestingly, Wojciech had no intention of stopping there. According to his plan, Helene's beloved son, Gildo, was supposed to die next, presumably so that Sylvia's share of the inheritance would increase to 12 billion euros. Pascal's interrogation lasted several hours, but it was clear that confessing had lifted a weight off his shoulders. He felt genuine guilt for his role in the murders and was the only one among the accomplices who behaved with a human conscience. It was time to speak with Wojciech, but first the detectives wanted to understand who he really was, and they uncovered some fascinating details. Wojciech hadn't always lived on the Côte d'Azur. He had known the other side of life, poverty and hardship. He was born in Poland in the 1940s into a family devastated by war. Post-war life was harsh, and he escaped the country as soon as he had the chance. In 1971, at 22, he arrived in London with little more than some coins in his pocket, ostensibly to study, but he never became a student. He found work in a bar, starting with washing dishes and steadily climbing the career ladder. He later worked as a dealer in a London casino, and his ambitions quickly earned him a managerial position. About 10 years after leaving Poland, he traded the foggy Albion for the glamour of Monaco. Wojciech became public relations director for the company managing the Monte Carlo casino. It was there, now a man of means rather than a poor Pole, that he met Sylvia Pastor. Her father was Polish, and Wojciech used his heritage to attract and charm her. The couple didn't marry, but they moved into a luxurious apartment owned by Sylvia's family. She managed the family's estate alongside her mother, while Wojciech focused on business, trading stocks and acquiring patents he hoped would bring prosperity. Yet in the small theater of Monaco vanity, he still craved a title. He set a goal to become honorary consul of Poland to climb Monaco's social ladder. Interestingly, he didn't further engage with the Polish community. Instead, he relied on financial support. It worked. In 2007, he was appointed honorary consul of Poland in Monaco. Finally, he had achieved the level of respectability that allowed him to invite high-profile figures, including Polish President Lech Kaczynski, to charity galas. Yet in reality, his authority was purely symbolic. The honorary consul title carries no diplomatic weight, it merely eases business dealings for Poles. But Wojciech claimed it meant he was the Polish ambassador to Monaco. He was the kind of man who exaggerated his achievements at every opportunity. He even claimed to have earned a PhD in economics from Cambridge. Those who knew him were skeptical, and rightly so. His intellectual level never suggested such an education. He admitted only to a few close friends that the fabricated degree had helped him enter the stock market. In short, his entire life was pretense, a performance, a show. Wojciech didn't just embellish the truth about his diplomas and titles, his skill at financial deception was unmatched. By digging into the accounts of the entire Pastor family, investigators uncovered some remarkable details. At the start of each month, Sylvia and her brother Gildo received 500,000 euros from their mother for personal expenses. Sylvia worked in the family's construction empire alongside her mother, but Wojciech managed all other financial matters. He convinced Sylvia to issue him blank checks, claiming that since he handled daily operations, it was inconvenient for him to ask her to sign each one to pay staff, maintain their boat, or cover everyday expenses. In reality, Wojciech brazenly exploited Sylvia's trust, spending far more than she realized. For example, she believed her eldest daughter's dentistry education in the US cost 500,000 euros, but Wojciech paid half that amount. Similarly, a yacht purchased in Italy cost 2-3 times less than she thought. The London house Sylvia bought, Wojciech registered it under his name and mortgaged it without informing her. Over 18 months of the 9 million euros Helene had transferred to Sylvia, about 7 million euros ended up in Wojciech's pocket. Meanwhile, he neglected mandatory expenses like life and car insurance, leaving Sylvia, one of Monaco's wealthiest women, driving an uninsured car. How did he conceal the transfers to himself? Wojciech executed a clever trick. He first moved the money to a shell company, then transferred it back to accounts under his control, creating the illusion of profit from his own projects. In reality, his companies generated no real income. He was a businessman without a business. Ambitious and proud, he resented his own financial impotence, especially compared to another family member, Gildo, Sylvia's brother, adored by their mother. Gildo had been an energetic race car driver in his youth and later invested in futuristic electric cars and motorcycles, establishing himself as an innovative entrepreneur. He pursued bold, successful projects, essentially embodying what Wojciech longed to be, but wasn't. Perhaps this resentment drove Wojciech to a fatal misstep that could ruin him entirely. In 2011, he decided to purchase an abandoned oil refinery in Poland. But instead of paying cash, he set up a company. Hudson Oil in Canada invested 250,000 euros, issued shares, listed it on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, and artificially inflated the stock price. This was illegal, and financial regulators discovered the scheme, causing major problems. Wojciech had intended to pay for the refinery with shares, but failed, and the Polish side canceled the deal. At the time, Monaco was unaware, but Wojciech feared public exposure above all. He would be humiliated, crushed, and Helene, already suspicious of her daughter's boyfriend, would see that her instincts had been correct. Wealth had honed Helene's instincts for caution, perhaps innate and genetically inherited. From day one, she considered Wojciech an upstart and an imposter. She quickly realized that his so-called projects generated no profit. She warned her daughter, but Sylvia's love for Wojciech blinded her. As if Wojciech's situation weren't already complicated enough, Sylvia fell ill. She was diagnosed with cancer. Naturally, the news was a shock to her, but Wojciech, suddenly realizing just how dependent he was on the Pastor family, panicked. He and Sylvia were not legally married, and she had not included him in her will. If she died, he would inherit nothing. Wojciech wanted Sylvia to marry him, but she refused, not wanting to upset her mother. In the Pastor family tradition, spouses of family members were not entitled to a large share of the inheritance. Under Monaco law, with 2 children, Wojciech could have claimed a third of the inheritance, but he was not the father of Sylvia's eldest daughter, who was from a previous relationship. After thinking it through, Wojciech concluded that he was in too disadvantaged a position to wait for Helene's natural death. He began to dream of acquiring more than 6 billion euros, which he saw as far better than playing with the meager 500,000 euros per month he was currently managing. The key question was, what did Sylvia, Helene's daughter, think about all this? Detectives quickly realized that she was not involved in the conspiracy. She was devastated by her mother's death and genuinely loved her. She acknowledged that Helene had not always been kind, a strong, perhaps overly strict mother, but also generous and fair. Sylvia considered her life wonderful and would never have thought of hastening the death of her own mother. She initially refused to believe that Wojciech could be connected to the murder. The police had to walk her through all the evidence against him, but even then, she struggled to understand how she had trusted a man who had been deceiving her for over 20 years. Of course, Sylvia was allowed to return home, while the police began interrogating the duplicitous Janus, Wojciech himself. The man resisted for a long time, but under the weight of the evidence, Wojciech finally admitted that he had ordered the murder of Hela Pastor. He explained that the woman he had described just days earlier as wonderful was, in reality, cruel, quarrelsome, and ruthless. He claimed he had orchestrated the killing solely to free Sylvia from her mother's grip. Wojciech denied any intent to kill the driver. He never expressed remorse or regret. For him, there was only one goal: saving his family, and in his mind, that goal had been achieved. He felt relief that he, his beloved wife, and children were finally freed from the supposed tyranny of his mother-in-law. That was his explanation. However, immediately after confessing, Wojciech retracted his statement. He claimed that Pascal, his trainer, was behind both murders. According to Wojciech, Pascal had blackmailed him, demanding 200,000 euros, threatening harm to his family if he didn't comply. To convince Wojciech of his seriousness, Pascal allegedly ordered the murder of Helen. Supposedly, that was why Wojciech yielded to the blackmail and withdrew 250,000 euros. Wojciech went even further. He allegedly asked his niece, a Polish lawyer, to bribe a witness, another Marseille thug, Francis Pointu, who had been in the same prison cell as Pascal. For 60,000 euros, Pointu agreed to provide false testimony in favor of Wojciech and against Pascal. Fortunately, the police uncovered this scheme and charged the conspirators accordingly. The trial began on September 17, 2018, and lasted 5 weeks. During this time, siblings Gildo and Sylvia did not utter a single word, revealing the deep scars this case had left on the previously close Pastor family. There were 10 defendants in total, including the mastermind, his niece, the shooter, the lookout, the so-called gendarme who provided the weapon, and several others who were in some way aware of the crime. Of all the accused, Wojciech felt the most confident. He was unbearably arrogant, had hired a top-notch lawyer, and clearly expected acquittal. Wojciech's defense strategy hinged on 2 claims: that he had not been provided a translator during questioning, he primarily spoke English and allegedly understood little, and that the police had coerced his confession. He implied that the officers had been rough and used force, though they hadn't actually done anything beyond questioning him. However, the prosecutors simply played the interrogation video, showing that Wojciech had been treated politely. The conversation had been calm, and his French was impeccable. It became immediately clear that the defense had lost, and Wojciech faced the maximum possible sentence. Then something incredible happened. To everyone's astonishment, Wojciech's lawyer stood up and confessed on behalf of his client. Wojciech was formally recognized as the mastermind behind the 2 murders and was sentenced to life imprisonment, alongside shooter Samin Said Ahmed and lookout Alher Hamadi. Pascal Doriac, the trainer, received 30 years, while the sentences for the other defendants ranged from 6 months suspended to 15 years. 2 were acquitted. Appeals were filed, but in November 2021, the appellate court upheld all sentences. The only modification was to Pascal Doriac's sentence, reduced from 30 to 22 years. A fair outcome, considering he had provided the police with crucial information and was the only one to show genuine remorse for his role in the horrific murder of Monaco's vice princess.
Friday, September 29, 2017. From early morning, meteorologists repeat the same warning. A thunderstorm is approaching the province of Utrecht in the Netherlands. The sky hangs low and leaden, and the air seems frozen in anticipation of a thunderclap. For most people, it's simply the beginning of the weekend. The perfect time to head home, turn on the heater, and wait out the rain behind closed windows. But for 25-year-old Anne Faber, that evening will become the start of a bicycle ride that will never bring her back. And the most important thing is that evening, no one yet understood that Anne's fate had been decided long before that road. Not here, not in the forest, and not on the bike path, but in a courtroom, in the lines of psychiatric reports, in decisions that had once been made, and that one day allowed a man to walk free who had no place among unsuspecting passers-by. And yet, there he is, standing right in front of her, and the knife in his hand leaves no doubt about his intentions. By 2017, The life of 25-year-old Anne Faber was quite full and eventful. Surrounded by love and support from her family since childhood, she was never afraid to dream big. Her father, Wim Faber, believed she would find her place in life no matter which path she chose. Anne decided that more than anything, she wanted to become the director of a museum. Not just any museum, but one like the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York. And for the sake of that dream, she was ready to work hard. She studied financial economics in Amsterdam, where she earned her undergraduate degree before moving to Utrecht, the fourth largest city in the Netherlands. There, she completed a master's degree in cultural economics and entrepreneurship, and now she had finally landed her first real job. Not at the Guggenheim Museum, of course, but it was a beginning. At the same time, Anne never forgot to spend time with friends, who loved her for her sarcastic humor and open heart. Her uncle, Hans Faber, said she could have fun as if there were no tomorrow. She could work incredibly hard when something needed to be done, and then a few days later spend hours lying on the couch watching romantic comedies. Because she always led such a busy life, filled with studies or work. In her free moments, she loved to get on her bicycle and ride outside the city to clear her head and relax. Anne had been cycling since her teenage years. In the Netherlands, of course, there was nothing unusual about her favorite pastime. She would leave home for a ride almost every day, paying little attention to bad weather or her mood. In fact, when she was feeling down, the fresh air and an easy ride often helped her feel much better. In September 2017, Anne had to briefly put her cycling trips on hold because she was trying to balance work with caring for her boyfriend, Nathan. He had recently been in an accident, injured his back, and needed her help. But thanks to her tireless care and support, Nathan was feeling much better by the end of the month. So on September 29th, at around 5 in the evening, Anne got on her bicycle and went for a ride around Utrecht. She told her boyfriend she would make a loop of about 20 kilometers and would be back in no more than 3 hours. The meteorologists had not been warning about the thunderstorm all day for nothing. A powerful downpour caught Anne already outside the city. It was 6:45 p.m. when she stopped, took a photo of herself, and sent it to Nathan. She is looking straight into the camera, completely soaked, with a rain-gray sky behind her. The caption said that she was 12 kilometers from home and would return soon. Nathan couldn't help but smile when he received the photo of his stubborn girlfriend, who had gone cycling in such terrible weather. He had no way of knowing that this would be the last image of Anne he would ever see, a picture that would soon spread all over the world. When Anne had not returned home by around 8 o'clock, as expected, Nathan tried to call her and send her messages, but received no response. He then called Anne's mother, Elze van Heeswijk. Elze tried to reassure Nathan, saying that Anne had probably decided to wait out the storm at a friend's place and would find a way to contact them later. But the hours passed. The storm grew stronger and with it the worry, which soon turned into panic. The next day, the bad weather finally subsided. The rain no longer drummed against the pavement, and the wind stopped howling outside the windows. But in the quiet that followed, Anne's family felt their fear more clearly than ever. Anne failed to appear at an important meeting in Amsterdam. She was responsible and punctual, and would never simply forget about something like that. Her family contacted the police. Because Anne chose a different route for her rides almost every time, her family had no idea where exactly to look for her. But fortunately, just before she disappeared, she had sent Nathan that photo. The police determined that this was the last moment when a cell tower was able to register the location of her phone. At that time, the signal was coming from the area of the Huis ter Heide Nature Reserve. This is a vast wooded area known for its heathlands and marshes, crisscrossed by numerous cycling paths. It is a beautiful, picturesque, and quiet place. But during the search for a missing person, those welcoming forest trails can turn into an impenetrable wilderness, unwilling to give up its secrets. Search groups were immediately organized, made up of relatives, friends, and volunteers, who began combing the forest from where the girl had sent the photograph. They assumed that some kind of accident had happened, that the storm might have been involved in her disappearance, that a tree brought down by the weather might have knocked her off her bicycle, or perhaps she had even been struck by lightning. The military police joined the search, along with tracking dogs, while helicopters surveyed the area from the air. Hundreds of people were looking for Anne, and on October 3rd they found the jacket she had been wearing on the day she disappeared. At that point, the police were considering two main possibilities. Either Anne had been murdered or abducted, or some kind of accident had occurred and she was lying somewhere in the forest, injured or dead. On October 5th, Anne's bicycle was found near a pond in Blocker Park. The bicycle was taken to a laboratory for examination, and the pond was completely drained. But it revealed no clues as to where the missing woman might be. The next day, Anne's backpack was discovered in the same park. Because her belongings had been found in different places, the police were forced to rule out the possibility of an accident. The discoveries themselves would soon become the key to solving the case. 2 days later, on October 8th, forensic laboratory staff discovered male DNA on Anne's jacket. When it was compared with the national DNA database, it produced a match. But when the police learned who it belonged to, they were stunned. The DNA belonged to 27-year-old Michael P., a patient at a psychiatric clinic. The police now faced a dilemma. How do you arrest someone who is already in custody, or at least under supervision? And what possible connection could he have had to Anne? Judging by Michael's photograph, he looked like a completely ordinary young man. The kind of person you wouldn't glance at twice if you passed him on the street. But when his story became known, what was inside his mind? Many began to wonder how he could have been walking the streets of Utrecht among unsuspecting people. Michael was born into a close, loving family, and his otherwise happy childhood was overshadowed only by the fact that other children teased him because of his poor eyesight. From a young age, he worked at his father's company, where he made a friend who shared his passion for racing cars and motorcycles. Michael had a fairly modest and achievable dream. He wanted to become a truck driver, but once again, his poor vision prevented him from fulfilling that wish. Michael was disappointed and depressed, and perhaps in an attempt to escape reality, he began racing through the streets in a car while under the influence of drugs with his friend. But soon that was no longer enough for them. They wanted to bring even more adrenaline into their lives. The young men began robbing people they encountered along the way, attacking passers-by and becoming increasingly aggressive and cruel. But even that was not enough for Michael. He once confessed to his friend that he had a strong desire to sexually assault a woman. The friend assumed it was just a perverse fantasy of a young man, but he was wrong. To understand what happened to Anne at the end of September 2017, we need to go back in time to 2010. On April 3rd, 2010, a celebration was taking place in the city of Nijkerk. An evening that was supposed to be remembered for laughter and happy smiles turned into a nightmare for two underage girls. A young man approached them who, at first, seemed as though he simply wanted to talk. But he threatened them, led them into a wooded area, and sexually assaulted both of them. They screamed and called for help, but in the dense thickets there was no one who could hear them. After getting what he wanted from his victims, the attacker left them in the middle of the road. When the girls were eventually found and helped, they identified their attacker, and he was brought to court. The rapist from that case, the same man now suspected in Anne's disappearance, was Michael P. Michael showed not the slightest remorse. On the contrary, he was proud of what he had done. In his defense, he said only that he had always fantasized about sexually assaulting someone, but had never really thought about the harm it would cause his victim. Such statements hinted at possible mental health problems in the young man. For example, a personality disorder, or more simply, psychopathy. For the justice system, it was important to determine what was going on in Michael's mind. He was sent to the largest forensic psychiatric clinic in the Netherlands for evaluation. And there, something happened that would later prove crucial for the future of Anne Faber. Someone, most likely his lawyer, apparently whispered to Michael in time that cooperating with the justice system could end very badly for him, possibly with a punishment worse than life imprisonment. The thing is, in the Netherlands, a person sentenced to life imprisonment may eventually be released on parole after about 25 years. At the same time, the country has a system of mandatory psychiatric treatment under which a person who has committed a crime is not released until a panel of psychiatric experts is convinced that the patient is completely safe for society. In many cases, such treatment lasts for the rest of the patient's life. Knowing this, Michael simply shut his mouth. He refused to speak with psychiatrists, and declined to undergo psychological tests. No one could force him, and without a diagnosis, the court could not impose compulsory psychiatric treatment. The judges could see that Michael's cruelty seemed only to be growing, but their hands were tied by this loophole in the law. For what he had done to the two girls, he was sentenced to 16 years in prison. It was a severe punishment, but it had an end date, and thanks to appeals and good behavior in prison, Michael would end up serving even less. His cellmates and some of the guards saw who he really was, a cunning manipulator. But in the eyes of the judicial system, he caused no problems and therefore appeared to be a model inmate. And just 7 years after the attack on the two girls, as his sentence was nearing its end, the process of conditional early release began, so that he would not be thrown straight from prison back onto the streets. In 2017, Michael was transferred to a psychiatric clinic in Den Dolder, in the province of Utrecht, where he could gradually get used to life outside prison under the supervision of specialists. At first glance, this seemed like a logical next step to help a former inmate reintegrate into society, but it was a mistake. This facility was meant for people who were almost ready to return to normal life. Michael was not ready to change. He was simply waiting for an opportunity to strike again. Worse still, the specialists at the clinic did not actually know who they had taken under their care. The prison had not informed the doctors in Den Dolder about what Michael had been imprisoned for. Why? Because Michael did not want them to. It was that simple. Without his consent, the prison could not share the details of his criminal history. The clinic was only told that he had been a model prisoner. The doctors believed in Michael's supposed exemplary behavior and accepted him into the program. After arriving, Michael was given the privilege of leaving the clinic whenever he wished without any supervision. The only condition was that he return to the facility by dinner time, and Michael made full use of this privilege, riding around Utrecht on his scooter. What is even more astonishing is that Michael did not even try to behave well in the clinic. He attacked other patients, hit and bit members of the staff, and displayed inappropriate sexual behavior toward nurses. Of course, he was punished for this. He would be briefly confined to a separate room, and sometimes, as a disciplinary measure, he was not even allowed to watch television. Because Michael could leave the clinic freely and go into the city, he met a woman with whom he began a romantic relationship. The relationship was far from stable or carefree. It was an emotional roller coaster. Soon, Michael's girlfriend discovered she was pregnant, but refused to allow him any involvement in the life of their child. This situation caused Michael's mental state to deteriorate. The doctors noticed changes in him but did not restrict his ability to leave the clinic whenever he wanted. In hindsight, it is clear that his time outside the clinic should have been limited, or he should have been returned to prison, because from that moment it was obvious that he would never reintegrate successfully into society, the very goal the doctors had been trying to achieve. One possible reason Michael continued to be allowed outside the clinic was that he was ostensibly learning a new profession. He convinced the doctors that he wanted to become a gardener, so they did not require him to miss classes. Later, it was revealed that he had not been attending them at all and had no real interest in completing the training. In fact, he was scouting for a new victim, and he found Anne Faber. In addition to the DNA, the police obtained other evidence against the suspect. It turned out that Michael's mother allowed her son to use her car, a Peugeot, and this was the missing link the police had been looking for. Kidnapping and transporting a girl on a scooter would have been difficult, but in a car, covering a long distance was no problem. Blood belonging to Anne, found inside the Peugeot, confirmed that the police were on the right track. Anne's family was horrified to realize that she could have fallen victim to such a monster. But on the other hand, it meant they were one step closer to finding her. During Michael's arrest, the police were rough with him, hoping he would reveal Anne's whereabouts. However, the officers only injured his shoulder, an injury he later used in his defense. Nevertheless, using various interrogation techniques, the police were able to determine where Michael had hidden Anne's body. He indicated Zeewold, a natural area on the shore of one of the largest lakes in the Netherlands. On October 12th, the police found Anne Faber's body at the location he had specified. But some details of the murder were unknown to Anne's family and the public until the trial began. It turns out that almost immediately after Anne took that last photograph, she was seen by Michael. More precisely, he claimed that they encountered each other on the path. she on her bicycle, he on his scooter. Because it was raining, there were no other people around. According to Michael, he initially just asked the girl if she was okay, but Anne supposedly insisted on calling the police. Michael was unhappy with this because his scooter was uninsured. He insisted that up until that moment he had no intention of harming Anne. It's highly unlikely that this is true. Most likely Michael noticed her while she was riding, or when she stopped to take a photo, but proving this is nearly impossible. Whatever the case, Michael pulled out a knife and intimidated her. He smashed her phone and led her further into the forest. He tied her hands with cable ties and brutally assaulted her in multiple ways. At one point, he saw another cyclist nearby and became afraid that his victim might call for help. This was the moment that shocked everyone in the courtroom. They realized that, until the very last instant, Anne must have hoped for a better outcome. She obeyed. She tried not to anger him. But Michael had already made his decision. He struck her and slashed her throat. Anne bled to death. Then the killer spent several hours covering his tracks. He scattered her belongings, jacket, backpack, and bicycle, in different locations, and buried the body shallowly under leaves. 5 days after the murder, Michael took his mother's car, dug up Anne's body from beneath the leaves, and transported it to Zeewolde, a place familiar to him from childhood. There, he buried her much deeper, after which he cleaned the car, visited his family, and even spent time with his pregnant girlfriend. In other words, he returned to normal life, while Anne's family was desperately searching for her. The most astonishing detail: around 10 p.m. on the day he reburied Anne, Michael called the clinic. He explained that he had missed dinner because he was in Amsterdam. He claimed he had relapsed and taken forbidden substances, something strictly prohibited, but he assured them that he planned to return to the facility. And what did the Den Dolder Clinic do? They did not punish him. He was simply given a warning. Anne's family, upon hearing this story, demanded a life sentence so that Michael would spend the rest of his days behind bars. But the prosecution took a different path. They knew that with a life sentence in the Netherlands, Michael would actually be eligible for release after 25 years, still a relatively young man. This time, Michael cooperated with the prosecution in hopes of a lighter sentence. A psychiatric evaluation confirmed that he required treatment. As a result, Michael was sentenced to 28 years in prison with mandatory psychiatric care. In other words, even after serving the 28 years, he will not be released until psychiatrists determine that he is completely safe for society. After the country learned about Anne's case and her final photograph spread across the world, the people of the Netherlands felt deceived and betrayed. They suddenly realized that the existing system was unable to protect them. More than 400,000 people signed a petition calling for changes to the legal system, and they succeeded. Now all institutions, whether penitentiary or medical, must share information about a convict's criminal history and mental condition. Every mayor must now know if a person previously convicted of a violent crime is walking freely in their city. The privilege of leaving a clinic is now something that must be earned. Many believe that the main goal of the penitentiary system should be rehabilitation and social reintegration. But here, a difficult question arises. To what extent can a person truly be reintegrated into society? Can someone who has sexually assaulted a child, tortured and murdered, return to society and live among others without committing further crimes? And why did hundreds of thousands of people rise to change the law if the system was already supposed to work?
It could have happened to anyone and at any time, but it happened to her. An innocent desire to withdraw some cash before meeting with friends turned into a nightmare for the schoolgirl. It took the kidnapper only 3 minutes and 45 seconds to attack the unsuspecting girl and take her away in an unknown direction. Where does such precision come from? The kidnapping was caught on video. In those years, it was rare for cameras to capture a crime, and detectives watched in horror as the image of the kidnapper appeared in the corner of the screen. They could hardly suppress the urge to shout to the girl through the screen, "Run, leave, he is already close," as if that could have saved her life. Friday, March 10th, 2000. For 18-year-old Sophia Martinez from El Paso, Texas, the end of the week meant a chance to relax and unwind with friends. She had worked hard throughout the year, but graduation was just around the corner, and she was confident she would successfully finish school. Preparations for this joyful event were already underway, including senior photos, which had been taken in advance. Sophia was such an excellent student that by her final year she was allowed to attend school only for half the day. Because of this, she found a part-time job at a store in a shopping mall. Usually, part-time work gives teenagers the opportunity to earn extra money for their own expenses, buy clothes, and spend more on going out with friends. But by her 18th birthday, Sophia had managed to save enough to buy a brand new red Pontiac Grand Am. She loved her car, which served as a reminder of everything she had achieved on her own, a reflection of her hard work and independence. But even that wasn't enough for Sophia. She had already started saving money for college. Sophia planned to attend the University of El Paso and, after graduation, work in her hometown as a history teacher. Despite her young age, she worked hard, studied, participated in programs for future teachers, and was on the verge of an exciting future. No one doubted that she would succeed. Sophia dedicated her free time to her family. She especially loved playing with her younger brothers and her nephews, the children of her older sister. And since Sophia spent so much time working, studying, and being with her family, she never had a steady boyfriend. But she wasn't a shut-in either. She enjoyed spending time with friends and occasionally going on dates. So she easily agreed when a coworker offered to set her up on a blind date. Her co-worker worked part-time as a hairdresser, and one of his clients, a very nice young man, seemed like someone Sophia might like. The three of them decided to meet at a popular club in El Paso on the night of Friday, March 10th, 2000. The club opened at 9 p.m., and they planned to meet at 11. Sophia's mother, Lourdes, and her younger sister, Marianne, helped her pick out a beautiful red dress in which she looked absolutely stunning. A little before 11, Sophia wished her younger brothers goodnight, kissed her mom and sister goodbye, got into her car, and drove off. Lourdes and Marianne watched from the window as the Pontiac disappeared from view. They weren't worried about Sophia because she was a very reliable, organized, and responsible person. Besides, they knew both her co-worker and the name of the guy she was supposed to meet. On the contrary, they were happy for her, excited that she was about to have a wonderful evening and meet someone new. But in the morning, when Marianne didn't find her sister in her room, she was surprised. The bed was neatly made, as if Sophia had never come home. Their mother didn't know where Sophia was either. The women truly became worried when Sophia's manager called and said she hadn't shown up for work. They started calling Sophia's friends, but no one knew where she was. Calls to the hospitals also led nowhere. That's when Lourdes contacted the police and reported her daughter missing. Unfortunately, different police departments do not always share all information about new cases. So when the police in El Paso received the report about Sophia Martinez's disappearance, they didn't know that their colleagues in New Mexico had already found a brand new red Pontiac in the desert on the Texas-New Mexico border. The car was parked about 100 meters from the road. It was in working condition, but the passenger side window was shattered, and inside the car, there was blood, a lot of blood. Next to the Pontiac were footprints from sneakers and tire tracks from another vehicle. The car was towed to New Mexico for examination. After checking the license plate, officers discovered the car was registered to Lourdes. Only after contacting her did they find out that their colleagues in El Paso were already investigating the disappearance of Lourdes' daughter, 18-year-old Sophia Martinez. Only then did the two police departments connect and share information. They were sure they needed to act quickly because Sophia was in danger. But the next morning, sad news arrived. Teenagers collecting tin cans in the desert noticed the body of a girl about 300 meters from the road. She was lying on her back. Her red dress was covered in blood, and her tights were torn. The teenagers didn't know it, but they had just found the body of Sophia Martinez. It was 16 kilometers from the place where her Pontiac had already been discovered. Detectives found neither identification nor the girl's purse. Her face was disfigured after several gunshots directly to the face. On the inner surfaces of her thighs, there were abrasions typical of sexual assault. Fortunately, the desert preserved valuable evidence: a shoe print from the perpetrator and a .22 caliber bullet. But what surprised the detectives most was a photograph of a child, which was somehow hidden in the left cup of Sophia's bra. This confused them because the missing girl didn't have any children. When Sophia's family was informed about the discovery of her body, they confirmed that she always carried a photo of one of her younger brothers with her. But that still didn't explain how the picture ended up in her bra rather than in her purse or pocket. However, at that moment, it was much more important to figure out what Sophia had been doing the evening of her disappearance. And unexpectedly, it was revealed that she had a blind date. Of course, the investigators invited the young man she was supposed to meet to the station. 21-year-old Ernie Hernandez admitted that he was late for the meeting because he was very nervous. But when he arrived, he was met only by their mutual friend at the club. They both waited for Sophia, but she never showed up, and Ernie decided that she had changed her mind about meeting him. He insisted that he didn't know what happened to the girl, and that he hadn't even had a chance to meet her. Ernie wanted to help with the investigation, so he allowed his house and car to be searched, provided his shoes for comparison, and gave a DNA sample. He even agreed to take a polygraph test. He was quickly cleared as a suspect. Unfortunately, despite this, people continued to whisper for a long time that he had killed the girl. Ernie lamented that he hadn't gone to pick up Sophia. If he had, she would still be alive. But how could he have known? He expressed his condolences to Sophia's mother, but Lourdes never blamed him for anything. She was sure that she and her daughter would have become friends if Sophia had made it to the club as planned. The autopsy was performed on March 13th, and it confirmed what the detectives already knew. Sophia had died after 5 gunshots to the face. Some of the bullets merely grazed her, while others were fatal. The victim had been assaulted, and the perpetrator's DNA was found on her body. The DNA was checked against the database, but the rapist was not found in it. But one clue did surface. On the floor of the Pontiac, there was a receipt from an ATM issued on March 10th, the day of the girl's disappearance. The receipt showed the time 10:23 p.m. This meant she had withdrawn money after leaving home and on her way to the club. This was a significant breakthrough in the case. After all, ATMs have cameras, so the officers would be able to review the video footage. There could also have been security cameras on the parking lot or in the nearby bank building. The officers went to the bank and, first of all, examined the area. Right next to the ATM, they noticed shards of glass. Later, experts confirmed that the glass had fallen from the shattered window of Sophia's Pontiac. Although the detectives were already sure of this, their hopes were also confirmed. The ATM was monitored by 2 cameras. When the detectives explained to the bank staff what they needed, they didn't even have to get a warrant. The staff were eager to help. The footage was not very clear, but by combining video from the 2 cameras and the one on the ATM itself, the investigators were able to see Sophia's abduction. They watched the footage with bated breath. It's important to remember that this was the year 2000. The number of cameras on the streets wasn't as impressive as it is today. While now there is a camera in every smartphone, and it's nearly impossible to hide from a watchful digital eye back then, the footage of Sophia's abduction left an indelible impression on the detectives. As they watched the video, they wanted to shout, to warn the girl, as if they could have changed anything. Here's what they saw. The red Pontiac arrived and stopped at the ATM at 10:22 p.m. Sophia rolled down the car window and began entering her PIN. The ATM camera captured the transaction displayed on the screen, and the investigators saw that she withdrew $20. Apparently, she wanted to have some cash before going to the club. It took just 30 seconds to withdraw the money and get the receipt, but Sophia didn't leave immediately. For about another minute, the camera filmed her as she put the money away, buckled her seatbelt, checked herself in the mirror, and touched up her hair and makeup. She looked happy and content. There was no one behind her, no line, so she wasn't bothering anyone. The club was only 10 minutes away, and Sophia was definitely not late, so she had time to enjoy herself in the comfort of her car. But just 2 minutes after Sophia pulled up to the ATM, and before she could drive off, a man in black clothing and a beanie appeared in the corner of the screen. He was holding a gun pressed tightly to his body. The man moved quickly to the passenger side of the Pontiac, but the girl had no idea. There was no one who could help her. In a matter of moments, the man sneaked up to the unsuspecting girl's window, and just 7 seconds after his appearance on the video, he was pointing the gun at the window, inches from her face. It looked as if he shot without warning. The investigators saw a flash, and simultaneously, the passenger's side window shattered. The bullet hit Sophia. This was the first shot fired by the criminal at her face, which didn't kill her, but injured her. Of course, it hurt terribly. She sat in shock, her head lowered, her hands pressed to her face when the man grabbed the door handle, but she didn't give in. He then darted to the door handle behind the girl. Unfortunately, the door opened, and the criminal climbed into Sophia's car. He shut the door and now sat behind Sophia. At 10:24 p.m., the girl withdrew money from the ATM again. During this time, she was holding a tissue to her face, trying to stop the bleeding. She now withdrew $200. At 10:25 p.m., Sophia drove away from the ATM. The criminal was still in her car and was clearly telling her what to do. It's unknown where they were headed, but it's known where Sophia and her car eventually ended up. After reviewing the footage, the detectives sat in complete silence. They had just witnessed the final moments of the 18-year-old girl's life, but to their horror, their only lead was the unclear image of the man in black. The police held a press conference explaining what had happened to Sophia and showing a photo of the kidnapper. Of course, the hotline was flooded with calls, but as usual, they were all unhelpful. However, one tip that came in less than 2 weeks after the murder seemed promising. In the desert near the spot where Sophia's body was found, a driver's license belonging to another woman was discovered. It turned out that she too had been the victim of an attack, but fortunately, she had survived. The robber had grabbed her purse at a shopping mall, and she had no idea how her documents ended up in the desert. The police theorized that the robber had simply thrown away the license after taking everything valuable from the purse. There were many similarities between the two cases. First of all, it was the same shopping mall where Sophia worked. Before the murder, Sophia had also been robbed. And finally, the document was found in the same place as Sophia's body. The media quickly jumped to conclusions and began to accuse the mall robber of the murder, creating such a stir that he turned himself into the police. His name was Josh Valenzuela, and he certainly did not want to be associated with the murder. He provided DNA, which did not match the rapist's DNA. Additionally, he did not resemble the criminal in the video. He was cleared from the list of suspects. Months went by. The bank near where Sophia was attacked installed additional surveillance cameras and improved the lighting around the ATM. Unfortunately, this was the only change in the case. However, people did not lose hope and continued to raise a reward for information about the killer. A local radio station, local businesses, and even Sophia's classmates all came together to fundraise. In the end, they managed to collect $51,000. 6 months passed, and everyone thought the case would remain unsolved. However, when the detectives least expected it, the police received a call from 20-year-old Heather Jacques. She confessed that she knew who attacked Sophia Martinez and that she had been haunted by nightmares for the past 6 months, but she couldn't come forward earlier. So what had changed now? Heather explained that one of the accomplices had been sent to prison for another crime, and that person was her still husband, Michael Angelo Jacques. Heather shared what she knew, or rather, what her husband had told her. In March 2000, Heather, who was expecting a child, was hospitalized with an infection. On the evening of March 10th, the same night of the attack on Sophia, Heather's husband, Michael Hackis, and his friend William Joseph Berkeley were with her in the hospital room. The men weren't shy about discussing their plans in front of Heather. From their conversation, she understood that they were going to get some money. Heather assumed they were talking about selling illegal substances, as this wasn't their first time doing something like that. They left later in the evening, but before they did, William, or Will, grabbed some gloves that were in a package in the room and a few packets of Vaseline. Heather was curious and asked, "Why do you need those?" "For that," Will snapped. Michael returned around 10 p.m., and Heather was sure of the time because she was watching the news. He immediately told her they had committed a robbery. Michael explained that he had dropped off Will at the ATM, where Will hid in the bushes. Meanwhile, Michael waited for him in the parking lot of a billiard club. Michael told his wife that he saw a red car pull up to the ATM. How he could have seen this from the parking lot of the billiard club, which was quite far from the ATM, was unclear. According to Michael, the driver of the car was entering the pin when Will approached the vehicle and shot through the window. He forced the driver out of the car and drove away, stealing the vehicle. Michael claimed he tried to follow the red car, but it was driving too fast. So he went back to the billiard club to have a couple of beers and wait for Will. However, Will never showed up, so Michael returned to the hospital to be with his wife. Since investigators had already viewed the video, they knew things didn't happen quite the way Michael described. It was unclear whether Will had misled Michael or if Michael was deliberately withholding details from his wife, especially since she was expecting their child. Will arrived at the hospital around midnight. The stolen car was still with him. Mike told Heather that they were going to drive the Pontiac out to the desert near the border and burn it. After that, he left. Heather fell asleep as she was still feeling sick. When she woke up in the morning, her husband was there. He told her that they had burned the car in the desert near the border, but that wasn't true. The car was found in a different location, not the one Mike mentioned, and it wasn't burned. On March 11th, Heather was discharged from the hospital. She decided to grill some steaks for her family and Will, who was living with her husband, and their 2 children. Heather was worried that her husband might get into legal trouble, and she started asking Will questions. She wondered what he would do if the woman whose car he had stolen had seen his face. Will turned around and smugly said, "I'm sure she saw my face." He then handed Heather Sophia Martinez's driver's license. Heather was shocked to see how young the woman was, just 2 years younger than her. She couldn't understand why he had taken her ID. Mike explained that this way, the victim would be too scared to report the crime, fearing that the criminals knew where she lived. Then right in front of her, Will threw Sophia's ID into the grill fire. The events that followed in their house frightened Heather even more. Will suddenly shaved off all his hair, including his facial hair. Heather also noticed a keychain for the Pontiac, which clearly had once belonged to Sophia, but now it had Mike's key on it. Heather realized that her husband was deeper into this situation than he let on. She was afraid that it could end badly and worried about their children, who might be left without a father, and possibly without a mother if she were considered an accomplice. On March 12th, Mike asked Will to leave their house because Heather didn't like his company. Heather indeed didn't like Will's presence, nor how the men acted as if nothing had happened. However, she was horrified when, on the news, she learned that Sophia Martinez had not just been robbed, but murdered after being sexually assaulted. Heather demanded an explanation from her husband, and she began to panic. But Mike told her to calm down and keep herself busy, like cleaning the grill to get rid of any evidence in case the police showed up. Heather, afraid of her husband, obeyed. She gathered all the ashes, put them in a bag, and threw them away, but she hid the partially intact ID of Sophia. Later, the couple went to court because Mike was accused of issuing a fake check. That was when Heather saw the $200 her husband had, the same amount Sophia had withdrawn from the ATM. Mike explained where he got the money. Heather didn't understand why Mike had the money if Will had stolen it. However, when the news showed the photo of the robber, Heather realized why Will had shaved. Despite the blurry image, she could have recognized him. Among Mike's belongings, she also found the shirt that Will had worn that day. Mike told her to throw it away. All this time, she hadn't dared to disobey him, but after Mike was arrested, she wasn't as afraid anymore. This was the first time that 23-year-old Mike Hackus had gotten into trouble with the law, but this time he ended up behind bars for domestic violence. Mike had beaten Heather, and she reported it to the police. She told him she was going to tell the detectives everything she knew about the Sophia case. Mike asked her not to rush and to wait for his release so they could go to the police station together, probably hoping for a reward. But Heather did it her own way. She told the detectives everything she knew, signed her statement, and gave them the almost untouched driver's license of Sophia Martinez. Mike, of course, couldn't have hoped for any reward, but he was given the opportunity to tell his version of the events. He immediately confessed to being an accomplice in the crime. He stated that he had participated in the robbery, but hadn't killed the girl. Mike explained that the idea of the robbery had originated because of him. He needed money for legal expenses related to the fake check, and without it, he risked going to prison. He complained to Will, and his friend promised to help. They discussed various options for getting money. Finally, Will suggested robbing someone at an ATM. Will got a black revolver and some black clothing. For a while, the men drove around the city, looking for an ATM that was in a quiet area with poor lighting. Once they found a suitable location, they parked the car so that Mike could see the ATM. Will got out, changed into black clothes, put on medical gloves, grabbed the gun, and hid in the bushes. Mike waited in the car and suddenly saw a shiny new red Pontiac. At first, he thought the driver must be wealthy, but then he realized it was a schoolgirl driving and started flashing his headlights. He wanted to signal Will to wait for the next car, but Will misunderstood his signal. Mike claimed he couldn't see what happened next, but when the Pontiac drove off, he realized that his friend was in that car. So he supposedly went back to his wife at the hospital. He told Heather that he had waited for Will at the pool hall. Will arrived at the hospital closer to 3 a.m., and Mike was surprised to see the broken window of the Pontiac. He asked what had happened. This was puzzling because Mike hadn't heard a shot, even though he was on an empty parking lot just a few meters away from the ATM. Will explained that he had tried to open the passenger door, but it was locked. He had intended to break the window with the revolver, but couldn't, so he shot instead. Only then did he realize that he had hit the victim in the face. He ordered the girl to open the door, and she obeyed. He got in. She tried to drive away, but he told her to take out the money, and only after that did he allow her to leave. The kidnapper then drove his victim into the desert. He told Mike that on the way there, Sophia had tried to negotiate with him, even offering him sex. Will had refused. Terrified, the girl asked him, "Am I going to die?" To which Will replied, "I don't know." In the desert, he forced her out of the car, and she asked him again if he was going to kill her. He said yes. Then Sophia asked the killer to give her a photograph from her purse. It was a picture of her little brother. She asked him to hold it for her in her final moments. Will brought her the picture, then aimed the gun at her forehead and shot. Sophia fell to her knees and he fired the remaining bullets into her. He confessed to his friend that he looked down at the dead girl and smiled. If Mike's words are to be believed, Will also chose not to share all the details with his friend. Mike helped Will drive the red Pontiac into the desert. Then Mike took Will home and went to the hospital to his wife. The man finished his confession by stating that he had thrown Sophia's car keys onto the roof of their house. The last time he had seen the revolver, it was on Will's father's nightstand. Officers did indeed find the keys on the roof. Now it was time to talk to Will. The suspect was only 21 years old. Previously, he had worked and lived with his girlfriend and their 4-year-old daughter. But suddenly, he abandoned his job, his girlfriend, and his daughter and moved in with Mike. However, after Mike kicked him out of the house, he returned to live with his parents. On October 1st, the police found the man hiding in his parents' bedroom. Interestingly, Will immediately confessed to the murder, taking full responsibility for it. He barely mentioned Mike. The man signed his confession. However, after speaking with his father, Will asked the detectives to meet with him again. It's likely that his father told him he was foolish to cover for his friend, as Mike had already confessed to the police. Will explained to the investigators that he and Mike had made a deal. Whoever the police caught first would take all the blame. "We were supposed to be brothers," he said bitterly. This time, he revealed more details about the kidnapping and murder, portraying Mike as the manipulator and mastermind of the crime. His version didn't differ too much from what the detectives had already heard from Mike, but Will tried to make himself seem more human in their eyes. For example, when he ordered Sophia to drive away from the ATM, he noticed she was bleeding. He was scared she might lose consciousness, so he moved to the driver's seat. Will dared to claim that he shot Sophia because she started making advances toward him, which made him uncomfortable. He said he fainted from fear, and when he woke up, she was lying on the ground, and he didn't know whether she was alive or dead. Terrified, he drove to the hospital, where Mike told him what to do next. The investigators didn't believe him, but they had his confession, and for the moment, that was enough. The police searched Will's parents' house and found the remaining black clothes, sneakers that left prints in the desert, and the revolver. Although the expert couldn't confirm that it was the weapon used in the murder, Will's DNA matched that of the rapist. Both men, William Joseph Berkeley and Mike Hackus, were charged with murder. Before the trial began, the prosecutor stated that they would seek the death penalty for Will. In Texas, these are not empty words. While in other states, a convicted person may pass away from natural causes before being executed, in Texas, the death penalty by lethal injection is a very real threat. Will was terrified and withdrew his confession. He claimed that he and Mike had only planned to commit the robbery, but their plans were interrupted by 4 girls. They picked him up when he was hitchhiking, and he went with them. Will argued that his only mistake was signing the confessions at the police station. Without glasses, he couldn't read what was written, and since his lawyer wasn't present, he thought he was signing a request to have a lawyer provided to him. Did he really think anyone would believe that? The trial of William began in April 2002. It should have been a triumph of justice for Sophia, but once again, her memory and her family were subjected to another insult. Will's father took the witness stand, stating that his son and Sophia had actually known each other. They had dated in the winter of 2000, but not for long. He said that a month before Sophia's death, his son had brought her home, and he remembered her because she was pretty, unlike the other girls his son had dated. Perhaps his current girlfriend and the mother of his daughter appreciated hearing that. However, Sophia never appeared at their house again, and his father asked his son why. Will claimed it was because of Sophia's family. He alleged that Sophia didn't want to introduce him to her family because he had a daughter. So they broke up. Needless to say, Sophia's family denied this, and it's unclear what the father of the accused hoped to achieve by saying this, as if their brief acquaintance could somehow mitigate the murder. However, it became clear what kind of people Will's family were made of. The jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death, despite his mother's pleas to spare her son. Mike Hackus was also found guilty, but was sentenced to life in prison. He must serve at least 40 years before he can apply for parole. On April 22, 2010, Will was executed. He gave an interview just before his death, but showed no remorse for the crime. He said that he felt sorry for the murdered girl, but he did not kill her. Some might argue that someone like Will wouldn't have been able to stay under the radar for long and would have been caught for another crime. But thanks to Heather, no one else suffered at the hands of Will and Mike. The police believe that without her intervention, the case could have gone unsolved. Since the crime occurred so close to the border, detectives had begun to believe that the killer had crossed it and they would never trace his whereabouts. Heather received a reward, which she likely needed, as after her husband's arrest, she was left to care for 3 young children. Unfortunately, Heather passed away in 2016 at the age of only 35. As for Sophia's family, they are left with only memories, personal belongings, and photos of the girl, including one taken for her upcoming graduation, never knowing that Sophia would never appear in that photo and that she would forever be 18 years old. This photograph serves as a reminder of what Sophia was robbed of, a happy future for which she had worked so hard and was so sure of.
Manipulation, control, subjugation. We often hear about couples who seemingly lived happily together for many years, where in reality, one partner completely subjugated the will of the other, forcing them to give up their actions, words, desires, and even thoughts. And it seems to us that such a situation couldn't have arisen out of nowhere. It must have developed over years. But does it really take that much time for one partner to suddenly decide, from now on, everything of yours is mine, including your life? Lily James was born in May 2002 to Jamie and Peter James. Together with her younger brother Max and her parents, she lived in New South Wales, Australia. From a young age, Lily was passionate about sports, particularly water polo. She was a member of her school's water polo team, where she was coached by her father. Jamie dedicated a lot of attention to his daughter's athletic training, and thanks to him, she earned the title of swimming champion in a competition for teenagers under 17 in 2019. The family's home also boasted numerous awards for her dance performances. Overall, Lily was not afraid of challenges. She set ambitious goals and achieved them. Her persistence and hard work allowed her to excel in almost everything she undertook. However, no matter how hard she trained, Lily always found time for her loved ones. Friends described her as intelligent, incredibly kind, and a loyal friend. Lily treated everyone with kindness and always strove to make her truly close ones feel loved. After graduating from high school in 2020, Lily enrolled in the Faculty of Sports Management at the University of Technology, Sydney. She confided in her friends that she dreamed of becoming an expert in physical education and sports, and perhaps one day starting her own business. In the meantime, to earn some money while studying at the university, she took a part-time job as a water polo coach at the prestigious St. Andrew's Cathedral School, and also became a dance teacher at a dance school and her alma mater, where she had recently been a student herself. Lily loved her work, and her students reciprocated her enthusiasm. She noted the strengths of her students and helped them unlock their potential. Her energetic, encouraging style had a huge impact on the kids. Despite her busy schedule, Lily managed her time effectively between her university studies and coaching work. Her parents almost always knew her schedule and when she would be coming home. However, on the evening of Wednesday, October 25, 2023, Lily's parents, Jamie and Peter, noticed that she had not returned from her shift at school at the usual time. Unable to reach their daughter, they called the police and reported her missing. Before the police could take any serious measures to search for Lily, another call came in just before midnight. This call was much more sinister. The caller, a man, informed the dispatcher that they should go to St. Andrew's Cathedral School, where they would find a woman's body. The man provided a very specific location for the body. Police officers immediately went to the specified address and found the body of a young woman in the showers of the school gymnasium, exactly where the caller had indicated. There was no doubt she had been murdered. Although the exact cause of death would be determined by the medical examiner, it was clear that the victim had suffered a series of horrific blows to the head, so severe that she was unrecognizable. She had died a terrible and brutal death. While the police began their investigation into the crime, the school suspended all classes and relocated the students to another campus. They issued a statement saying that only students taking exams necessary for their higher education certificates had remained in the school. A university representative asked journalists not to disturb the exam takers, as the exams were crucial for their successful graduation. He referred all other questions to the police. Meanwhile, officers cordoned off the perimeter of the building as well as the areas adjacent to the campus. They thoroughly searched the entire school and its surroundings for any possible clues. However, they did not find any significant evidence, such as the murder weapon. By the morning of Thursday, October 26th, the brutally beaten young woman found at the school was identified. The victim was 21-year-old Lily James. According to the autopsy, She had been beaten to death with blows to the head, most likely with a hammer. The news that Lily had been beaten to death devastated her parents, brother, and everyone who knew her. People couldn't believe what had happened. They gathered together to light candles and remember what a wonderful person Lily was. Lily's best friend, Christina, said a heartfelt farewell. "For 16 years, you were like a sister to me. You were everything to me. I love you more than anything in the world. We had so many plans, so many things we wanted to do. You will always be my angel up there." Meanwhile, the police reviewed surveillance footage from cameras located both inside and around the school. This allowed them to piece together a sequence of events. Around 7 p.m., Lily was seen on the cameras heading toward the gym showers. A man followed her in the same direction shortly after. There were no cameras in the showers, so they both disappeared from view for an entire hour, after which only the man emerged. Lily did not appear on the video again, indicating that she was killed during that time. The man who followed her became the prime suspect in the investigation. Fortunately, the same footage allowed the police to quickly identify him. He was 24-year-old Paul Thijssen. Paul was a Dutch citizen who moved to Australia with his parents, Esther and Steph Thijssen, in 2015 when he was a teenager. He attended St. Andrew's Cathedral School, where he demonstrated exceptional talent in sports. Many of Paul's classmates considered him a pleasant, intelligent guy and an excellent student. He loved sports, was talented, and generally seemed like a happy person. After graduating from high school in 2017, he returned to the Netherlands for a few years, completed university, obtained a working holiday visa, and came back to Australia. Paul got a job at his former school as a cricket and hockey coach. Additionally, he was responsible for overseeing the sports equipment. Besides working, he decided to continue his education, hoping to become a teacher. His life and immediate future plans were closely tied to the school. In Australia, Paul shared a house with 2 other roommates. They described him as quite reserved and never causing any trouble. Overall, Paul knew how to charm women, and Lily was no exception. A young, attractive guy who was as passionate about sports as she was, it was natural for them to try being a couple. Paul and Lily started dating just 5 weeks before her death. They hadn't yet made their relationship public or shared photos together on social media. Naturally, their closest friends knew about their relationship, so it wasn't a secret, but they didn't announce it everywhere. This decision to keep things private was probably wise because just 5 weeks later, Lily broke up with Paul. If everyone had known about their relationship, they would have had to deal with awkward questions and other inconveniences. Friends of Lily reported that they didn't notice any warning signs. The couple didn't argue, and Paul didn't mistreat her in front of friends. However, according to Lily, Paul tried to control her. Being a people pleaser, she didn't want to hurt him. Instead of cutting off communication completely, she wanted to let him down gently, so she continued spending time with him even after ending the relationship. Criminal psychologist Tim Watson-Monroe, analyzing the case, stated that for someone like Paul, with his controlling, dominant nature, Lily's kindness and desire not to hurt him didn't matter. It's clear she was kind, pleasant, and polite, but your kindness doesn't matter when you're dealing with a toxic, controlling, and sensitive person. Even if you remain firm and stand your ground, they become more aggressive, tougher, and more dangerous. The most dangerous time for a victim is when they have left or are about to leave, and the partner feels they are losing control because such people can't stand losing control. Such men often repeat a pattern of failed relationships, underpinned by deeply hidden hatred towards women, and they can't handle rejection. He will try to dominate others, show a high level of narcissism, and attempt to cut off her other relationships and isolate the girl, who ultimately becomes a victim of total control, explained the criminal psychologist. Having identified the suspect on the school's surveillance cameras, the police were able to more precisely track his movements before and after the crime. On the fateful morning of October 25th, another surveillance camera captured Paul as he entered a store located down the street from his home. There, he purchased a hammer. He also asked a family member to borrow their 2003 Lexus sedan. He used this car to drive to work, to the school, on the day of the murder. Presumably, he requested the car to quickly flee the crime scene after the murder, as he typically didn't drive to school. Then at 9 p.m., he was seen walking towards the school gym showers following Lily. What happened there? There could have been at least 2 possible scenarios. Paul might have attempted to talk to Lily, asking for another chance for their relationship. If she said no, He could have either erupted in anger and struck her with the hammer, or he may have already decided that if she refused, he would kill her. The second scenario is that Paul came to the school with the intent to kill Lily. He lured her there, where they would be alone, grabbed the hammer, and struck her multiple times in the head, venting his rage at her for daring to break up with him. Afterward, he took Lily's phone. Paul either knew her password from when they were dating or used Lily's fingerprint to unlock her phone. Regardless, he sent a message to her father from her phone, asking him to pick her up after work, even though he knew her car was parked at the school. The police tracked Paul's phone to determine his next movements. Leaving the school building, Paul got into the Lexus sedan and headed to the Vaucluse area, near the cliffs of Diamond Bay Reserve. This is a very well-known area, primarily for its expensive homes with breathtaking panoramic views. However, the Gap is also notorious for being a spot where people sometimes choose to jump from the high cliffs onto the rocks below. Paul knew about this place because he and Lily had visited a friend here a couple of weeks ago, but this time, Paul came alone with much more sinister intentions. Once again, surveillance cameras aided the police, capturing Paul's arrival at the Vaucluse suburb around 8:47 p.m. He parked near the end of the road. At 9:04 p.m., he exited the car and walked up the road, where he found a bin and disposed of the hammer he used to kill Lily. He then returned to his car, sat inside, and remained there for 2 hours. He dialed 000 himself to contact the police and report his crime. This was the call that led the police to the school, where they found Lily's body. And it was this call that helped the police track Paul to the Vaucluse suburb. By the time the police traced this lead and reviewed the camera footage, Paul was nowhere to be found. Officers located the Lexus, which they towed to the station for further examination. They also found a trash bin containing Apple earphones, likely belonging to Paul, but the man himself seemed to have vanished into thin air. Authorities searched on the ground and from the air until Friday morning, October 27th, when construction workers called the police after spotting what looked like a body on the rocks beneath the cliffs of Diamond Bay Reserve, the same area where police had searched for Paul the previous day. Police deployed rescuers with helicopters and scooters to reach the indicated location. After several hours of coordinated effort, they indeed found the body of a man. It was unclothed and bruised all over, wedged between large boulders at the base of the cliff. It took several more hours of coordinated effort before rescuers could retrieve the body from the water. An autopsy confirmed that the body belonged to 24-year-old Paul Tyson. After killing Lily, he had come to the cliffs, disposed of the murder weapon, and sat in his car for 2 hours before reporting his crime. Then he approached the edge of the infamous cliff and jumped. The hunt for Lily's presumed killer may be over, but for her family, it's far from the end. Lily's parents, Jamie and Peta, have decided to sue the school. They believe that the school, which charges parents $40,000 a year per student, clearly lacks adequate security measures. The couple hopes that the lawsuit will compel the school to change its approach to safety within its walls and prevent a recurrence of such events. As for Paul's relatives, his parents, Esther and Steph, were informed of their son's death and what he had done. Paul's parents chose not to transport his remains to the Netherlands, but to cremate him and scatter his ashes in Australia. For them, this is as difficult as it is for Lily's family. In a sense, it might even be harder for them to accept what happened. They thought they knew their son, and now they too cannot find answers to the questions. What could have led to this outcome? How could Paul transform from a normal guy to a cruel murderer in such a short period? Not knowing Paul, and since he's no longer with us to answer these questions, we can't definitively know why he killed Lily or wanted her body to be found, or why he left the way he did. But according to forensic psychologist Watson Monroe, Paul was trying to stage his play until the last moment. After he completed the most shocking stages of his plan, he sat in the eastern Sydney suburb of Vaucluse for several hours and used this time to create even more chaos. He still believed he hadn't lost control. But having disposed of the murder weapon, Paul thought about his future, the likely prison term, and his future in Australia. After all, he wasn't an Australian citizen and his third visa was expiring. Watson Monroe asserts that narcissists usually don't end their lives, but he may have panicked because he realized the consequences of his actions. He wasn't crazy and knew he faced a very long prison term. Criminologist Dr. Xanthi Mallet agrees that Paul's manipulations in the final stages of his deadly plan were his last attempt to regain control before he gave up on that idea and his life. In this light, Paul's desire for Lily to be found as soon as possible is very interesting. Perhaps he hoped someone would find her and call an ambulance. Did he want people to know Lily died at his hands or just feel guilt? Or did he want the police to think she was killed later, so he sent the message to her father? Or maybe he hoped that when officers arrived at the school after his call, they would find Lily's father there and accuse him of killing her. Despite Paul no longer being able to answer all these questions, this is a very important case because it shows, no matter how little time you spend with someone, they can still crave full control over you. That's why it's so crucial to pay attention to the quietest warning signs. Intuition isn't given to us for nothing, and if it tells you something's wrong, it probably is. This is an unusual case because more often we see such things happen to couples who have lived together for years, but Paul had been dating Lily for just over a month, and he needed so much control over her that when she broke up with him, he decided the only way to end the relationship on his terms was to take her life.
In this eerie, shocking, and unjust story that took place in the small American city of Fitchburg, Wisconsin, winter, so characteristic of this region, played a significant role. Wrapping everything in soft white snow on the eve of the winter holidays, it could just as easily turn cold, icy, frosty, windy, and fierce. Black ice on the roads, prolonged power outages, blizzards, snowstorms, and heavy snowfall. Winter in Fitchburg is the real thing. At times, an imposing layer of snow would completely paralyze the roads, and schools would close. The winter of December 2005 was no exception. 25-year-old Angela Nicole Drake grew up in Wisconsin and was not afraid of the cold. December, with its traditional decorated Christmas trees, snowfall, and pre-holiday bustle, was her favorite time of year. So on Thursday, December 8th, despite the surprisingly frigid weather and about 10 centimeters of snow, Angela, or Angie, didn't stay home but decided to spend the evening enjoying herself. The thing was, Angie was a nurse who worked with children with special needs. She was a wonderful nurse, getting along beautifully with the kids and able to connect even with those whom other nurses struggled to reach. The children adored her, but it was clearly an exhausting job, both physically and emotionally. That's why Angie needed those rare but meaningful moments of rest. So on December 8th, after work, she met up with her close friend Rachel, and the two happily headed to their favorite karaoke bar, the Dry Bean Saloon and Steakhouse. From there, they planned to go to Rachel's place, which was literally a 5-minute walk from the bar. They intended to spend the night, and in the morning, when both had to go to work, Rachel would drop her friend off at her car, which Angie had left near the bar. The friends had done this a million times before, and this time was supposed to be no exception. Outside, the bitter cold raged, but inside the bar it was warm, crowded, and decorated for Christmas and New Year's. Angie and Rachel felt at home there, ran into many acquaintances, and had a wonderful time. Angie, who had a beautiful voice, as always sang her favorite song by Janis Joplin, "Piece of My Heart." Overall, it was a pleasant but ordinary evening, until one moment. Rachel and Angie always left together, but this time Angie decided to stay at the bar a little longer, and Rachel went home alone at around 11:30 p.m. Rachel promised to leave her apartment door unlocked for her friend and headed home. She was sure that Angela would be perfectly fine because they felt at home in that karaoke bar. They knew all the staff and many of the patrons, which meant they were among friends there, even if they hadn't arrived with them. Besides, Angie had only had a small amount of alcohol, and it would be no trouble for her to walk the 5 minutes to Rachel's apartment. However, when Rachel woke up in the morning, she discovered that the apartment door was still unlocked, and there were no signs that her friend had come by and already left for work. In other words, she had not shown up at Rachel's place at all during the night. At first, Rachel wasn't worried. After all, nothing prevented Angie from going to her own home. Fortunately, she lived only about 20 minutes from the karaoke bar. The only thing that troubled Rachel was that her friend hadn't texted or warned her not to wait up. But when, a couple of hours later, she tried calling Angie and the phone went straight to voicemail, Rachel decided that this was already strange. She called Angela's father, with whom the young woman was living at the time, and asked whether his daughter had returned home. It turned out that Angela was neither at home nor at work, because her colleagues had also just begun looking for her. None of her friends or acquaintances had heard anything from her. All of this was unusual, but it is worth emphasizing that she was a 25-year-old independent woman, so her family did not rush to panic. However, when evening came and there was still no news, Angie's loved ones thought to check the parking lot of the karaoke bar. They found Angela's car in the same spot where she had left it. It was covered in snow, and it was clear that the vehicle had been sitting there for nearly a full day. Her family knew that the bar had been warm, so Angie had gone there wearing only a red sweater, a warm vest, jeans, and boots. Fearing that she might have slipped on the way to her friend's home, hit her head, and be lying somewhere in such light clothing, her relatives walked the route from the bar to Rachel's house, but they found no one and nothing. By the evening of the following day, Angie's father called the police. As the second day since the young woman's disappearance was already underway, officers immediately got to work. First, they spoke with Rachel. She told the police that when she left her friend at the karaoke bar, Angie had not been alone but with a young man. Tall, tanned, fair-haired, and blue-eyed, the man was very attractive. Angie introduced her new acquaintance as Oliver. He was clearly her type, so Rachel wasn't surprised when her friend said she didn't want to leave yet. Rachel didn't insist and went home, assuming her friend knew best what she was doing. The officers hurried to ask the bar staff whether they had seen Angela and whether they knew this Oliver. They recalled seeing the young woman but could offer little else. In their memory, the days had blurred together, and they couldn't say exactly who did what that evening. Fortunately, investigators could see for themselves. The establishment had several surveillance cameras recording the premises from different angles. After reviewing the footage, investigators saw a blonde woman in a bright red sweater and an attractive young man, evidently Oliver. Rachel confirmed that it was him. Unfortunately, the cameras did not cover every corner of the establishment and did not capture how the young people interacted at the bar. However, one camera did record Angie leaving the venue at exactly 1:30 a.m. Angela looked happy. She almost seemed to be dancing as she walked. She was not leaving alone, but in the company of two men and another woman. As they exited, one of the men reached out and took Angie's hand. Detectives believed this was Oliver. Since none of Angie's family or friends recognized Oliver or his companions, the police turned to the public. They released Oliver's photo to the media, hoping that someone would recognize him, and they got incredibly lucky, because Oliver himself contacted the police. He readily confirmed Rachel's account and explained that he and Angie had been talking for about an hour. But when he briefly turned his attention to his friends, Angie had already moved on, chatting cheerfully with another young man. Then they went to play pool, and Oliver didn't see them again. Investigators showed the witness the footage of Angie leaving the bar with a young man, but Oliver was quick to assure them that it wasn't him. He had left with his friends. After Oliver's friends all confirmed in unison that he had gone with them, detectives went back to the footage, studying it frame by frame. The image quality was poor, but it appeared that Angie had indeed left with someone else. This mysterious young man was taller, dark-haired, and most importantly, wearing a jacket with a distinctive emblem on the chest, something that could potentially be identified. The police again turned to the public for help, but this time they didn't release a blurred image of the dark-haired stranger's face. Instead, they focused on the emblem on his jacket. They also tried reviewing footage from other street cameras, but there was little hope there. First, such cameras are usually aimed at a business's own entrance or parking lot. Second, during the heavy snowfall that night, very little could be clearly seen on video. Meanwhile, Angie's family couldn't sit idly by. They wanted to help the police spread the word about her disappearance as widely as possible. They used the tools available in 2005. Angie's mother and stepfather wrote an email describing her, what she was wearing, and attached a photo, marking it missing, and sent it to everyone in their email contact list, asking recipients to forward it. Fortunately, the plan worked, and within a few days, thousands of people had received the message. Among them was 23-year-old Tom Allen. Tom went to the police station and explained that that evening he had been at the karaoke bar with his roommates Marcy, Shane, and Michael DeSalvo, as well as a friend visiting from another city, Peter. Marcy met Angie at the bar and introduced her to the rest of the group. Since Angie's friend Rachel had already gone home by that time, Tom assumed the young woman was there alone, without friends. He also noticed that she had consumed quite a bit of alcohol. Angie joined their group, and they played pool together. Around 1:30 a.m., they left the karaoke bar, as recorded by the surveillance camera. Following Angie, Mike came out of the bar, wearing the jacket with the emblem. It was a work jacket issued to him by his employer, a company providing septic tank cleaning services. Tom said they left the karaoke bar to go to another nearby bar called Monkey Shines. They split between two cars. Tom and Peter got into Tom's car and drove ahead, while Marcy, Shane, Mike, and Angie were supposed to follow. But when Marcy and Shane arrived at the bar, they reported that Mike and Angie had dropped them off and left. The friends assumed that Mike had been concerned about Angie's condition and had driven her home. Their surprise was great when they later discovered Angie in their apartment. She was lying on Mike's bed, apparently having fallen asleep from drinking too much. Mike was in the process of taking her boots off. Shane and Tom discussed whether they should intervene. The issue was that Mike had only recently moved in with them, and they didn't know him well enough to be sure he wouldn't take advantage of Angie's defenseless state. They didn't want to leave her alone behind a closed door. They considered knocking on Mike's door and offering to move Angie into one of their rooms, with one of the guys sleeping on the living room couch. Tom even remarked that if it had been his sister, he would have wanted someone to take care of her. Yet for some reason, Tom and Shane deliberated and did nothing. They went to sleep, and by around 9 a.m., Angie was no longer in the apartment. Mike briefly explained that he had driven her wherever she had asked to go. Later, the guys asked Mike whether he had been intimate with Angie. He told one of them yes, and the other no. This was odd, but the friends got caught up in their own lives and problems, and nobody thought about Angie again until Tom saw her photo in the forwarded email. The investigators quickly spoke with 24-year-old Michael DeSalvo. He readily confirmed that he had been at the karaoke bar that evening with his roommates. Angie had joined them and even wanted to go with them to another bar, but Mike decided it would be better for her to rest. According to him, she fell asleep in the car, and he carried her into his home. He put her to bed so she could recover and tell him where she wanted to be taken. She stayed at his house until 5 a.m. Mike had to wake her because he needed to go to work and also give her a ride home. Angie told him where to go, and he drove her to a private house about 15 minutes south of his apartment. He didn't wait for her to go inside. He just waved goodbye and left for work. He never saw or heard from her again, and they didn't exchange phone numbers. When investigators asked if he had had any sexual contact with Angie, he said he didn't remember. The investigators wanted to believe Mike, especially since his story matched what his roommates had told them, and Angie's home was indeed about 15 minutes south of his apartment. But if his account was true, something must have happened to Angie literally at her front door, which was hard to believe. Investigators also checked the backgrounds of all the young people who had interacted with Angie that night and found that only 24-year-old Mike DeSalvo had prior police encounters. He came from Minnesota, where he lived in a fairly upscale area, but in a very frugal household. Since he didn't have expensive possessions, cars, or vacations at the world's best resorts, his peers often mocked him. When he got tired of this, Mike fell in with a bad crowd and began doing reckless things, such as allegedly stealing a car from a dealership under the pretense of a test drive. He committed thefts and experimented with illicit substances. However, his offenses did not go beyond that, and he had never attacked women. Nevertheless, investigators obtained a search warrant for Mike's room, his work van, and his personal car. In the van, under the passenger seat, officers found Angie's phone. While this could potentially be explained without malicious intent, the next discoveries were far harder to justify. In the trunk of his personal car, they found a bag containing Angie's boots, underwear, jeans, and belt. So what does that mean? Had he been driving her around in the cold while she was barely dressed? Or had she changed into his clothes for some reason? That scenario wasn't entirely impossible. If Angie had felt ill, vomited, and soiled her own clothes, she might have needed to change. But what compelled Mike to burn her identification? Yes, exactly. The police found a charred ID in a trash bag near his house, and there was soot on his shoes, suggesting he had recently been near a fire. The detectives decided they had to prepare for the worst and begin searching for Angie's body. Since Mike had only a few hours before his roommates woke up, he wouldn't have had time to bury her. especially in such cold, damp weather when the ground at the surface was as hard as stone. He could only have hidden the body somewhere, under a bridge, in a roadside ditch, or a similar spot. Officers divided the city into sections and began systematically searching each one. They deployed helicopters, hoping that Angie's red sweater would be visible from the air. They combed wooded areas, nature trails, and lakes, but the entire city was blanketed in snow, making the task significantly more difficult. On December 22nd, around noon, while one of the officers was surveying the area between Mike's house and Angie's home, he noticed a small, inconspicuous bridge. It spanned a steel tunnel through which, in warmer months, a tiny stream ran. Guardrails had been installed on both sides of the road to prevent anyone from accidentally slipping down. The officer looked over one side of the guardrail and saw nothing. He glanced at the other side, still saw nothing, but decided to go down anyway. Later, he admitted that as he approached, he already had a premonition that he would find Angie, as if something was pushing him to search there. On one side of the tunnel, he saw nothing. The cold was biting, but he couldn't leave without checking the other side. There, he leaned over, shone his flashlight, and noticed a strand of light-colored hair. Even before official identification, it was clear to everyone that the body belonged to Angela Nicole Drake. She was dressed only in a red sweater and socks. Nearby lay the warm vest she had worn the day she disappeared. There were no obvious wounds or injuries. It appeared as though she had fallen asleep, seeking shelter from the cold in the tunnel. Leaves clung to her body, and beneath her, the snow had melted. She was lying face down, her arms pressed to her torso, fists clenched, and dirt in her hands. The medical examiner who arrived at the scene could tell even without an autopsy that she had been holding her hands to her chest to keep warm, suffering from the cold. This meant that she had been alive while lying in that icy tunnel. The autopsy confirmed the preliminary findings of the medical examiner. Angie had been left in the tunnel, where she died in agony from the cold. The pathologist also determined that she had engaged in sexual contact before her death. However, there was one detail he could not state with complete certainty. He found signs of asphyxiation but could not definitively say what caused it. Either a pillow had been placed over her face in an attempt to suffocate her, or she had vomited and inhaled the contents, obstructing her airway. The latter theory was supported by blood traces on the mattress in Mike DeSalvo's room and evidence of aspiration in her lungs. Aspiration occurs when food or liquid enters the respiratory tract instead of the esophagus. In other words, it was possible that no one intentionally tried to suffocate her, and the asphyxiation happened accidentally. But in any case, asphyxiation was not the cause of death. Angie died from hypothermia, extreme cold, because she was left nearly naked in a tunnel at -15 degrees Celsius. Whoever left her there alone, unclothed and intoxicated, had condemned her to almost certain death. The detectives hypothesized that the events of that night unfolded as follows. Mike brought Angie to his home and carried her inside. She had obviously consumed too much alcohol to give meaningful consent, and he took advantage of her vulnerable state. From there, two scenarios were possible. Either she regained consciousness, tried to resist, and threatened to call the police, forcing Mike to act, perhaps attempting to suffocate her by placing a pillow over her face, or she became sick and vomited, making it impossible for her to breathe, and Mike assumed she had died. In either case, he placed her in his car and drove her to the tunnel, leaving her there, believing she was lifeless. Angie regained consciousness in that terrifying dark tunnel. In -15-degree temperatures, nearly unclothed, she froze rapidly. Hypothermia prevented her from standing, moving onto the road, or attracting attention. All she could do was press her arms against her body, trying to preserve the little warmth she had left. She was alone, terrified, aware that she was dying, but utterly powerless. She died in excruciating agony. How could a normal evening at a karaoke bar turn into something so unimaginably horrific? And yet, Angie had loved the winters in her native Wisconsin so much. But it wasn't only winter that killed her. The weight of guilt rested on the person she had met that evening. However, proving it in court would not be easy. Although Mike DeSalvo was initially charged with first-degree murder, the prosecution had to prove not only that his actions led to Angie's death, but also that he had intended to kill her, and that was much harder. After all, He could simply claim that he woke up and found her lying unconscious, assumed she was dead, panicked, especially given his criminal history, and disposed of the body. The prosecution had heard that story 1,000 times and knew their chances of winning were slim. As a result, there was no trial. Mike DeSalvo was offered a plea deal, which he accepted. He was charged with first-degree negligent homicide, for which he will serve 25 years in prison. This means he could be released as early as 2031.